In 188.5, under the burning sun of the Wyoming frontier, a woman stepped off a train carrying nothing but a carpet bag and a letter full of promises. Her name was Elsie Parker. She was 56 years old, unmarried, and had crossed the ocean with half her life savings and all her hope tied to a single piece of paper. That letter, written by a widowed rancher in Cheyenne, had offered the chance for something she had never dared to believe in: a home, a family, and perhaps companionship in the twilight of her life. Elsie wasn't a woman of vanity or dreams spun too high. For 30 years, she had worked as a seamstress in London's East End, bent over a sewing table, threading needles in poor light to turn worn cloth into dignity. But when machines replaced her trade and her debts mounted, she saw the letter not as an escape, but as the last door opened to her. The man who wrote it was Harold Jamison. He promised stability and needed someone of strong character and sturdy build to help raise 2 boys and keep a ranch running. Elsie, small-framed but resilient, believed character would matter more than muscle. But when she stepped down from that train onto the dusty planks of the Cheyenne depot, it took only seconds for that illusion to unravel. Harold was there, just as promised. He looked at her once, from boots to bonnet, then shook his head. "You're smaller than I expected," he said, his tone full of disappointment. "I asked for a sturdy woman. This won't do." She tried to answer, to explain her strength, her years of hard work, but he was already tipping his hat with cold finality. "I'll arrange for your return passage. Good day, miss." And just like that, he walked away. Elsie remained standing there, a woman in her best dress, with nowhere to go. The red dust of the Wyoming plains blew around her skirts. Her carpet bag felt heavier in her hand than it had ever been, filled not just with needles and buttons, but with the weight of humiliation. Her heart, so full of cautious hope when she boarded the ship weeks ago, now felt like broken glass beneath her ribs. She spent that night alone on a depot bench, using her bag as a pillow, staring up at a sky unfamiliar and far too vast. The stars above Cheyenne didn't comfort her like they might have comforted someone born beneath them. To her, they only reminded her how far from home she was, and how foolish it had been to believe she could start over at her age. But what Elsie didn't know, what she couldn't see through the sting of shame and rejection, was that someone had been watching her, not with judgment, not with pity, but with quiet attention. Just beyond the edge of the corral, where the cattle stirred and the dust hung in the air like smoke, a man stood. He was tall, impossibly tall, with a broad frame and silver hair beneath a weathered hat. His name was Ezekiel Boon, but no one called him that. Folks simply said, "Zeke." And when he saw Elsie Parker standing alone, trying to gather her dignity as her dreams fell apart, something stirred deep in his chest. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know the story behind the fine carpet bag or the tears she refused to shed. But what he saw was enough, because Zeke, too, had known loneliness. And sometimes it takes one wounded soul to recognize another. Before we continue, ask yourself this: when was the last time you believed something beautiful could grow from rejection? Because for Elsie Parker, her story was only just beginning. And Zeke? He was about to take the first step toward changing both their lives. In the next part of the story, we'll follow what happened when this silent cowboy finally spoke. If this moment has touched something in you, stay with me. What comes next might just restore your faith in second chances. The morning after Harold Jamison's rejection broke her hope, Elsie sat beneath the depot's overhang, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of weak coffee the station master had kindly offered. Her eyes were tired, her spirit frayed, and her future uncertain. The bustling rhythm of Cheyenne moved on without her, cowboys and townsfolk too busy chasing their fortunes to notice the solitary woman with a worn carpetbag and nowhere to go. But not everyone failed to see her. Across the dusty yard, Ezekiel Boon stood at the edge of the cattle corrals, his hat shadowing a face carved by wind and sun. He watched her, not out of idle curiosity, but because something about the way she held herself, even in defeat, struck a chord deep inside him. Zeke was not a man who spoke more than needed. Life had taught him silence could be a refuge, and that words, once given, should mean something. He had lived alone for years, working the cattle ranges, sleeping under open skies, building things with his hands, and letting time wear down the sharp edges of his memories. The world saw a giant of a man with strength to move mountains, but few saw the weariness in his pale blue eyes. That afternoon, as the station emptied and the sun slid toward the horizon, Zeke made a quiet choice. He dusted his hands, left the cattle to his men, and walked toward the depot. Elsie didn't notice him at first, not until his shadow fell across the plank floor beside her boots. She looked up, startled, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He removed his hat, revealing silver-streaked hair, and nodded with respectful ease. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and gravelly but gentle, "I couldn't help but notice you've been here since yesterday. Forgive me for intruding, but is everything all right?" Elsie straightened, as if summoning the last reserves of dignity she had left. "I'm quite well, thank you," she said, though her voice wavered. "Just waiting for the eastbound train." Zeke didn't press. Instead, he studied her quietly for a moment, then nodded again. "Begging your pardon, but you look like someone who's had a run of bad luck." She hesitated, then offered a small, brittle smile. "You could say that. I'm Ezekiel Boon. Folks call me Zeke." "Elsie Parker," she replied, then added with a trace of dry humor, "formerly of London, and more recently a mail-order bride who didn't quite meet the specifications." He didn't laugh, didn't smile, just nodded slowly, thoughtfully. "I figured as much," he said. "Saw you speaking to Harold Jameson yesterday. Saw how it ended." She looked down, shame tightening her throat. "He's not a cruel man," Zeke continued. "Just someone with a narrow view of what matters. Thinks strength is in size, not in heart." "And what do you think?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. Zeke didn't hesitate. "I think character is what counts. Kindness. The strength to keep standing when the world wants to knock you down." Then, the words sank into the silence between them, warm as sunlight. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw no judgment in his face, only quiet sincerity. A man carved by solitude, perhaps, but not hardened by it. "I've got an old line shack about 3 miles out," he said after a moment. "Nothing fancy. 1 room, good roof, near the creek. You'd be welcome to stay while you figure things out." She blinked, caught off guard. "You don't even know me." "No, ma'am, but I know what it's like to be alone. And I don't believe helping someone is a debt that needs justification." Elsie hesitated. What would people think? A woman alone, accepting shelter from a man she just met? Zeke's smile was small, but genuine. "People will think what they want. What matters is what you think. Do you trust me?" She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of ill intent. Found none. Only calm steadiness. "Yes," she said softly. "I believe I do." "No." "Good," he replied. "Then let's get you off this platform before dark." Later that evening, Zeke's wagon creaked to a stop beside a small cabin nestled by Antelope Creek. The logs were weathered, the stone chimney crooked, but it stood solid and true against the wind. Elsie stepped down, her carpetbag in hand, and stared at what would be her shelter. It wasn't grand, but it felt safe, and after what she'd been through, safety was a gift beyond measure. Zeke opened the door, let her step inside first. The scent of dust and pine greeted her. The room was plain, but dry. A bed frame in one corner, a table near the window, a fireplace with wood already stacked. "It's perfect," she whispered. He turned to her and said something she would remember for a long time. "Helping you, Miss Parker, isn't a burden. It's a privilege." And for the first time since stepping off that train, Elsie Parker felt the weight in her chest begin to lift. There was no promise between them. No grand declarations, only quiet respect, and the first flicker of something she hadn't dared feel in months. Hope. The cabin by Antelope Creek was not much by most standards. It had only one room, a stone fireplace, a table by a window, and a straw mattress that creaked when Elsie shifted at night. Yet, to her, it was the closest thing to a home she had known in years. The mornings were cold but quiet, the kind of quiet that settles not just around you but within you. Elsie would wake early, warm water in a tin pot over the fire, and brew coffee with the grounds Zeke had left. It was strong and bitter, but it filled the space with the scent of comfort. She drank it slowly, wrapped in a shawl, listening to the creek murmur outside the window. There was a peace here that she had never found in London. In the East End, even silence had a weight to it, always pressed against by factory whistles and voices echoing down stone alleys. Here, the silence breathed. It allowed room for thought, for memory, and maybe even for healing. Each day, Zeke would arrive around mid-morning. He never came empty-handed. Sometimes it was supplies from town. Other times it was firewood, or food, or a pair of sturdy boots he thought she might find more comfortable than the city shoes she wore. He never overstayed. He would ask if she needed anything, share a cup of coffee, maybe talk about the weather or the cattle herds moving north. Then he would tip his hat and leave, always with that same quiet grace. But one morning, he brought something different. "I've got a shirt needs mending," he said, holding it out. "Caught it on barbed wire last week. Would have stitched it myself, but I reckon I'd just make it worse." Elsie took the garment gently, examining the tear. The seam had split along the shoulder, and 2 buttons were missing. "This is good cloth," she said. "Hand-woven. Hard to come by these days." Zeke nodded. "Was my father's. Been wearing it every season since I could ride fence alone." "I'll take care of it," she said softly. "It deserves more than a quick patch." From that day on, she began to mend for him. Shirts with frayed cuffs, pants torn at the knee, jackets with worn seams. He paid her, always more than she asked, and she accepted only because she knew pride ran deep in men like him. But it was more than a transaction. Each garment told a story, and she read them with her hands, each stitch a kind of listening. She imagined where he had been when the fabric tore, how many winters he had endured in these clothes, how much of himself he gave to a life that asked everything and promised little. She found herself humming as she worked, something she had not done since before the machines replaced her in London. She began to arrange her things on the cabin's shelf, her mother's thimble, her needles, her threads wound tightly in soft hues of blue, brown, and rust. She reclaimed the rhythm of a life that had once made her feel whole. Sometimes she would see Zeke through the window, working near the creek, cutting wood or adjusting the fence around the pasture. He moved with quiet strength, never hurried, never loud. There was something about the way he treated the land, the animals, and even her, that spoke of respect, not pity, not obligation, just the honest acknowledgement of another soul. He brought her seeds one day, a small pouch filled with wildflower and vegetable varieties. "Thought you might like to plant something," he said, a little awkwardly. "So it doesn't feel like a stopover, more like something that's yours." Lo, Elsie took the seeds, held the pouch in her hands like something precious. It had been a long time since anyone gave her something that held no expectation, only quiet hope. She began planting along the edge of the cabin, just a few rows to start. Beans, lettuce, a patch of sweet peas that would, she hoped, climb the cabin wall come summer. Each morning, she checked the soil, watered gently, whispered encouragement to the tiny green shoots. As the days passed, something began to shift. The cabin no longer felt like a borrowed space. The land no longer felt foreign. Her hands no longer shook when she sewed, and her heart, once locked away in caution and regret, started to open just a little. Zeke never pressed, never hinted at more. But every time he handed her another shirt, or helped carry a bucket to the creek, or simply sat beside her on the porch in silence, Elsie felt a warmth rise that had nothing to do with the fire. She had come to this place with the weight of failure on her shoulders. But here, beside a quiet man and a murmuring creek, she began to feel something she hadn't known she'd been searching for: belonging. It was late spring when the trouble came, carried not by storms or wild animals, but by people. People with opinions, sharpened by gossip and dulled by empathy. One afternoon, as Elsie swept the porch of the small cabin, she saw the dust rising from a wagon long before it reached the clearing. By the time the horses stopped near the fence line, the tension in her chest had already begun to build. The wagon held 4 women, dressed in high collars and wide hats, their expressions tight with purpose. At the front sat Mrs. Lillian Abernathy, head of the Ladies' Temperance and Morality Society of Cheyenne. She held the reins with the same rigidity she applied to her sense of righteousness. Elsie wiped her hands on her apron, straightened her back, and walked down the steps. "Good afternoon," she said, as politely as she could manage. Mrs. Abernathy didn't return the greeting. She stepped down from the wagon and looked Elsie over, her eyes pausing at the apron, the cabin, the garden now blooming along the porch rail. "Mrs. Parker," she said coldly, "we've received reports of a woman living alone in the company of an unmarried man. Naturally, we were concerned." "I am not alone," Elsie replied calmly. "I have been offered shelter, not impropriety." One of the younger women behind Mrs. Abernathy muttered something under her breath. The others exchanged glances that stung more than words. Mrs. Abernathy crossed her arms. "A woman of your age, staying under the same roof as a man, without a ring or a license, invites judgment. We are here to offer a solution before your situation worsens." Elsie's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "What solution would that be?" "There is a home for women in Cheyenne," Mrs. Abernathy said. "The Charity House. Clean, respectable, with other women in similar transitions. You'd be taken care of, supervised. No whispers, no shame." "Oh, eh?" Elsie blinked, unable to speak for a moment. Shame. That word hit harder than she expected. "I appreciate your concern," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "But I am not in need of supervision. I am in need of respect." Mrs. Abernathy's mouth tightened. "Respect is earned through proper choices, Mrs. Parker, and living in sin is hardly the way to earn it." Before Elsie could respond, a voice rose from behind her. "She's not living in sin." And Zeke stepped from the barn, hands still dusty from his work, his face unreadable, but his tone firm. "She's living in safety," he continued, "which she had precious little of before she came here." Mrs. Abernathy turned to him, frowning. "Mr. Boon, you're well respected in this county, but this arrangement, whatever it is unbecoming." Zeke took another step forward. His voice did not rise, but it did not waver either. "Helping someone is not unbecoming. It's human. She needed shelter, and I gave it, with no demands, no conditions. If your eyes see more than that, maybe the problem lies with your view, not her choices." Elsie felt heat rise behind her eyes, not from shame, but from something stronger. Gratitude. For months, she had stood on her own, bracing herself against winds she couldn't name. But here was someone who didn't just stand beside her. He stood in front of her, when it mattered. Mrs. Abernathy's expression didn't soften. "The church will hear of this." Zeke nodded. "Let them. And tell them this too. There is no crime in kindness." The women returned to their wagon in silence, though not without casting final glances filled with judgment. As the dust from their departure settled, so did the silence. Elsie turned to Zeke, her voice low. "You didn't have to say all that." He looked at her, eyes steady and honest. "Yes, I did. And that was all." That night, Elsie sat by the fire and thought about the sting of Mrs. Abernathy's words. She thought about the look in the other women's eyes, about how quickly they had chosen condemnation over compassion. But mostly, she thought about Zeke, about how he had spoken not as a man defending a woman, but as one person defending another. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was dignity. And dignity, once given, has a way of planting its own kind of seed. 2 days after the visit from Mrs. Abernathy, the wind shifted, not in the weather, but in the air between Elsie and Zeke. Something unspoken lingered, as if a decision had been quietly pacing the room, waiting for the right moment to speak. Zeke arrived just after sunrise. The sky was painted in shades of copper and rose, and dew still clung to the porch rails. He brought no tools, no shirt needing mending, only a look in his eyes that told her this morning would not be like the others. He set down his hat gently on the porch rail and cleared his throat. "Miss Parker," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I have something I want to ask you, not out of urgency, and not because of what was said the other day, but because it's been weighing on me for some time." Elsie paused in pouring water for the coffee, her hands stilling. "I've thought about it," he said. "What people think, what they might say. But more than that, I've thought about what you deserve. She turned to face him, cup in hand, unsure whether to brace herself or listen with an open heart. You came here with nothing but your name and your dignity, and I don't want either to be questioned on account of me. She didn't interrupt. He went on, choosing each word with care. I want to offer you marriage, not because I expect anything from you, not because of obligation, but because I respect you, and because I believe in protecting what is good. Oh, the world seemed to still for a moment. The creek murmured softly in the distance. A bird called out from the trees. Elsie stood frozen. Her heart beat faster, but not in the way she had expected. Not excitement, not joy. Something more complicated, a blend of fear, surprise, and the sharp ache of confusion. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything right now, Zeke replied gently. And if the answer is no, that's all right. You can stay here as long as you like. You have a home either way. She looked away, trying to steady her thoughts. It's not that I'm ungrateful, she said. I am, more than you know. But I need to be sure. I'm not saying yes just to pay back kindness with obedience. He nodded. I wouldn't want that either. I've lived most of my life, making decisions that pleased everyone else. Sewing for others, stepping aside when I had something to say, staying quiet so I wouldn't be a burden. If I say yes to you, it has to come from a place of wanting, not owing. Zeke's expression didn't change. He simply reached for his hat, held it in his hands, and said, Then take all the time you need. No matter what you choose, you are not beholden to me. You are your own person, and if you decide to stay here, I'd rather it be because you feel free, not trapped. Elsie blinked back, something sharp behind her eyes. I need to think, she said softly. I understand. Then, that afternoon, she walked down to the edge of Antelope Creek, to the flat stone where she sometimes sat and watched the water move. She brought no sewing, no basket, just herself and the wind. The water ran smooth and steady, carrying fallen leaves and small twigs away to somewhere she could not see. She watched it and wondered how many choices in her life had been hers, truly hers. For a long time, she sat in silence, legs drawn close, hands clasped in her lap. The warmth of Zeke's words stayed with her, gentle as sunlight on her shoulder. She did not yet have an answer, but for the first time in her life, she had the space to find one. And that, perhaps, was more powerful than the question itself. Weeks passed as the small cabin by Antelope Creek slowly transformed from a temporary refuge into a place Elsie began to call home. She and Zeke worked side by side, repairing fences, tending to the garden, and building the foundation of trust that neither had dared hope for before. One afternoon, while organizing a small stack of papers Zeke had left on the table, Elsie's fingers brushed against an official-looking document tucked beneath a rough ledger. Curious, she unfolded it and gasped. The document was a legal deed, and it named her as the owner of not just the cabin and its immediate surroundings, but thousands of acres of land stretching across the Wyoming territory. Her eyes raced over the typed words, 2,000 acres of grazing land, complete with cattle rights and mineral claims. She looked up just as Zeke entered the cabin. The expression on her face was a mixture of shock and confusion. Zeke, she began carefully, what is this? How can I own so much land? He sighed and ran a hand through his silver hair, the familiar shadow crossing his pale blue eyes. I suppose it's time I told you the truth, he said quietly. I'm not just a simple cattle drover, as I've let you believe. My father was Marcus Boon, one of the first men to drive cattle into this territory. He built a ranch that covered most of this valley before sickness took him. Zeke. Elsie listened, her mind trying to catch up with the reality unfolding before her. I inherited his land, along with the debts and the reputation, Zeke continued. It took me 10 years to pay off what he owed. I've lived as a hired hand by choice, not necessity. I didn't want anyone to see me as anything but the man I am, not the man I might appear to be. Elsie's heart ached as she realized the burden he had carried silently for so long. The kindness he had shown her had come from a place of honesty and humility, not pretense. But why hide it? she asked softly. "Why not tell me from the beginning?" He looked at her, eyes steady and filled with a mix of regret and hope. "Because I feared what would happen if people knew," he said. "I feared they would see the land, the money, and forget the man. I was afraid they would love the wealth and not me. I wanted to know if you cared for the man, not the holdings." "Oh." Elsie felt a whirlwind of emotions: surprise, confusion, and a deep respect for the man before her. Yet, she also wrestled with her own pride and fears. Could she trust him fully after this secret? Was her growing affection real or simply a response to his generosity? And beneath it all was a quiet gratitude for the life he had offered her, a life far beyond what she had dared to dream. She folded the deed carefully and looked into his eyes. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said. "But now, I need to understand what this means for us." Zeke reached out and took her hand gently. "No matter what happens," he promised, "this land is yours, free and clear. It doesn't come with strings, only with the hope that you find happiness here." In that moment, Elsie realized that their story was more complicated than either had imagined. But beneath the uncertainty lay a truth: neither could deny a connection built not on possessions, but on shared respect and the courage to face the future together. Over the following weeks, Zeke set to work building a new house on a rise overlooking Antelope Creek. The simple line shack where Elsie had found shelter would soon be replaced by something more enduring, a home designed not just for shelter, but for life. Elsie watched as timber frames rose against the vast Wyoming sky. Zeke worked with steady hands and careful precision, cutting and fitting each board with the skill of a man who built not for show, but for generations. One afternoon, as the walls took shape and the roof began to catch the light, Zeke invited Elsie inside the unfinished house. The air smelled of fresh pine and sawdust. He showed her the layout: a main room with a stone fireplace, a bedroom tucked away for privacy, and, most importantly to Elsie, a small sewing room with 2 large windows positioned just so to catch the soft morning light. "I thought you might like a space just for your work," Zeke said quietly. "A place where you can create without worry." Elsie's eyes filled with tears. The thoughtfulness, the attention to her needs, was overwhelming. "It's perfect," she whispered. Zeke reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. He handed them to her gently. "This house is yours," he said simply. "If you choose to stay, you'll have a home that no one can take away. The key is yours, and yours alone." There was no pressure in his words, no demands, just an open hand and an invitation. Elsie held the keys tightly, feeling the weight of their promise. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the distant hills, Zeke turned to her with a seriousness that made her heart race. "I want to ask you again," he said softly. "Will you marry me?" Her breath caught. This time, the question was not just about protection or reputation, but about something deeper, something real. She looked into his pale blue eyes and saw there the same kindness and honesty that had drawn her to him from the start. "I will," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Not because of the land or the house, but because my heart feels at home with you." Zeke smiled, relief and joy shining through his weathered face. "That is all I ever wanted to hear," he said. As the twilight wrapped around them, Elsie felt a peace she had never known. She was no longer a woman abandoned on a distant platform. She was a partner, a wife, and finally, at home. Their story had taken them from rejection to belonging, from loneliness to love. And in the quiet strength of that new house, their future began, built not on wealth, but on trust, respect, and the courage to open their hearts. The morning of their wedding dawned crisp and clear, with a gentle breeze stirring the pine needles and wildflowers around the newly built house. Zeke had spent days crafting a simple arch of pine boughs and prairie roses, their delicate petals woven through the greenery to create a natural canopy. It stood just outside the front door, framing the wide Wyoming sky behind it. Only a few close friends gathered: Mrs. Henderson from the general store, the judge who had promised to perform the ceremony, and a handful of ranch hands who had come to respect the quiet partnership between Elsie and Zeke. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. Under the arch, Elsie and Zeke exchanged vows that spoke not of grand promises, but of honesty, respect, and the courage to build a life together. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Zeke's kiss was gentle, a quiet sealing of their journey from strangers to partners. Later, as the sun climbed higher, they sat on the porch sharing coffee from an old tin cup, its surface worn and dented from years of use on the trail. Zeke handed the cup to Elsie with a smile. "This was mine, but now it's ours," he said softly. "May every morning remind us of where we started and how far we've come." Elsie sipped the bitter brew and smiled, the warmth spreading through her like the soft light of dawn. 6 months later, Elsie had become a well-known seamstress in the Wyoming Territory. Her skill with needle and thread was sought after by ranch wives and daughters alike. Orders poured in from neighboring towns, and the small sewing room Zeke had built became a bustling workshop filled with laughter, fabric, and the steady rhythm of creation. Her days were full, her hands busy, and her heart peaceful. She had found more than a home, she had found a purpose and a place where she belonged. One evening, as the sun set in hues of rose and gold, Elsie stood on the porch of their home and looked out over the rolling grasslands, stretching to the horizon. The land was vast, wild, and full of promise, much like the journey that had brought her here. She turned to Zeke, who was already waiting with a smile, and took his hand. "No one is ever too late to find a home for their soul," she said quietly. "Not too late to find love, or hope, or peace." Together, they watched as the stars began to twinkle in the vast Wyoming sky, their hearts full of gratitude for the life they had built on stitch, one moment and one shared cup of coffee at a time. If you have ever believed that love is only for the young, let this story change your mind. Sometimes love arrives when we least expect it, in the quiet moments and the second chances life offers. Tell me, who do you relate to more? Elsie, the woman searching for a home for her heart after years of struggle, or Zeke, the silent man patiently waiting for the right person to share his life with? If you believe that kindness can truly change a destiny, do not forget to subscribe. This is only a part of their journey, and there is much more to come. Stay with me as we continue to explore how two souls find hope, healing, and love where they thought none could grow.